The killer makes sense. All signs point to him. The green paint, the bowling balls, of course, the bowling balls. How could I forget? But the motive. Why would he do this? What's the point? There's too many things here, too many conflicting points of evidence. It can't be just jealousy. Oh my God. Oh my God, it all makes sense.
Fredd'n.
Bowling balls, am I right? They're great for hitting plush babies, getting gutter balls, and of course, bashing over the head of those you're envious of. But seriously, what is the deal with Glamrock Bonnie? I mean, don't get me wrong. When Security Breach first came out on December 16th, 2021, it took the community by storm in some good ways and some not so good ways, but no ways were more interesting than the mystery ways. That sounded better in my head, but we're rolling with it. And speaking of rolls, Security Breach was on a roll with the sheer amount of new mysteries it brought to the table. Curious on what the Fredbear plush with a walkie-talkie meant? Well, here, have Nightmarionne plushies hiding around the Pizzaplex. Confused on what happened to Mike in Pizzeria Simulator? Well, here, have his whole room hidden behind a tiny Alice in Wonderland hole. But no rabbit hole was bigger than that of the mysterious new band member, Montgomery Gator. Security Breach gave us two new characters added to the main band, Roxanne Wolf and Montgomery Gator. Roxanne Wolf made sense, her name Roxy being an obvious play on Foxy, and her filling that canine-like hole the band would have without Foxy. And that isn't to say Foxy doesn't absolutely dominate the Pizzaplex. I mean, you can see Foxy just about anywhere around, albeit posters, cutouts, or an entirely revamped Kids Cove. But Bonnie? Well, Bonnie's just kinda gone. Replaced with this new guy, Montgomery Gator, angry, confident bad boy, and all Bonnie was left with was a bowling alley. But the game makes it clear to us that it wasn't always this way. Throughout the game, if you're paying attention, you can learn that Montgomery Gator wasn't always the base player. In fact, there was a Glamrock Bonnie. Security Breach is littered with duffel bags that contain information about the game's background leading up to the events of the game. And a few of these duffel bag messages tell us about the late Glamrock Bonnie, the first of which is titled Missing. Security report, 12:24 a.m. Bonnie is seen leaving his green room in Rockstar Row heading east toward the atrium. 2:40 a.m. Bonnie enters the East Arcade. 4:12 a.m. Bonnie enters Monty Golf. Interesting. So we're already learning about the late hare. Importantly, he was walking around the Pizzaplex way after closure and took quite a weird path as well. If we look at the atrium and game, we see the East Arcade is placed above Monty Golf. In fact, there's really no path that leads directly to Monty Golf from the East Arcade, so it makes no sense as to why Bonnie would even be there. In fact, let's sit down to think about this message for a second. Bonnie takes 2 hours to get from his green room to the atrium, something it definitely doesn't take in game. Not to mention, he then spends another 2 hours to get from the East Arcade to Monty Golf, which is directly under it. So what's going on? Well, maybe the answer will get more clear as we look at what more of these messages have to tell us. The next message we find is titled Understudy. Management report. With Bonnie out of commission, we are making Monty the new bass player. Parts and Services has already done the proper adjustments. This could be a good thing. Monty could be even more popular than Bonnie. So Bonnie was last recorded in Monty Golf before his disappearance, and right here is Monty replacing Bonnie. We even later learn that Monty gains the claw upgrades that Bonnie's endoskeleton has in order to play bass. Monty upgrade. Maintenance log. Monty. Montgomery's claw upgrades allows him to play the bass. Not to mention that Monty, when in power, portrays violent tendencies and outbursts with destructive consequences. Following performances, he mostly uses them to cause damage. The fence repairs are getting costly. all of this builds up for a pretty good reason for Montgomery Gator to have killed Bonnie. He's already a violent and jealous-fueled animatronic. Bonnie's last recorded appearance was in Monty Golf. Monty benefits from the disappearance of Glamrock Bonnie by becoming the new bass player in the band. Hell, in Ruin, Monty is even killed by a Glamrock Bonnie sign, something that's been noted by a team member of Steelwool to be ironic. There's only a few big problems with this being the complete narrative. The first and biggest problem comes from Five Nights at Freddy's Ruin. As we mentioned, Montgomery Gator dies by the spiritual hands of Glamrock Bonnie. But that's not all we get of Glamrock Bonnie in the game, because we get his final resting place. Hidden behind Bonnie Bowl, you can find the destroyed corpse of Glamrock Bonnie, a bowling ball smashed over his head, torn carpet beneath him, surrounded by wet floorbots. Most terrifyingly, we see Bonnie's eyes still glowing, as if he's powered by something a little more than what's in his endoskeleton. But this room is where the mystery deepens. Remember how I mentioned there being a torn carpet underneath Bonnie? Well, let's take a closer look at it. Taking a close look at the carpet reveals an interesting find. The ribbons of it are faded yellows, greens, and blues. But there's the bigger question: where is this carpet from, and how do we know when we found the location? Well, based on text logs about Bonnie Bull needing a retheme, we can deduce that Bonnie's death is actually very recent in comparison to the events of the game, with Monty's takeover being extremely fast. More on that later. So it's fair to assume that wherever we find this carpet will have a noticeable patch missing. As for where this carpet comes from, the best place to start looking for candidates is locations relating to our mangled Bonnie friend. And what's a better starting place than the location we find the corpse? Bonnie Bull. And we'd be in luck, because looking at the carpet design in Bonnie Bull, we can find an exact match. However, we find an even further problem. There's no missing segment of carpet anywhere. In fact, the place it appears is pretty small, and there's not much carpet that isn't covered in arcade machines. So is there anywhere else we can find this design? Well, a similar design is in Monty Golf, but the colors are off, so it couldn't be there. Not to mention, no recent patches of carpet are torn from there, ruling it out even more than it already was. Well, this design does show up in another arcade, and this one is more personal to Glamrock Bonnie, the East Arcade. But, and I'm saying but again, this carpet has the same problems as the one in Bonnie Bowl. No missing segments, covered by arcade machines, and no space for Bonnie to kick the Glamrock bucket and get dragged onto Bonnie Bowl. Remember, Bonnie Bowl is on the other side of the atrium in comparison to East Arcade and Monty Golf. So is there anywhere else we can see this carpet? And that's when I point out one more candidate: Roxy Raceway. Roxy Raceway is an area that's notably under construction, as it's built on top of a sinkhole / an entire freaking restaurant, sectioned off from the rest of the atrium, almost as if it's the perfect place to kill someone where no one would see. And within Roxy Raceway are 2 party rooms. The second one isn't too notable, having scattered party supplies, but it does notably have these FNAF 2 posters on a party table. This will be important for later. It's the first room that changes everything. Another party room. But let's take a look at it. Same carpet design as the others, but a whole section of carpet is missing. And the environment of this room wants us to know. A flashing light showing it. I think this little box is where Glamrock Bonnie died. And take a look at what's nearby. A party table with a single purple party hat sitting on it. And what surrounds it? Green and yellow paper plates that have purple on the inside. Green and yellow. That's easy. Montgomery Gator. However, the purple on the inside shows us a darker secret. Monty was induced to kill Glamrock Bonnie by none other than Glitchtrap. But why? Why would Glitchtrap want Glamrock Bonnie dead? It doesn't make any sense. The animatronics are seemingly under the Mimic's influence, exemplifying their negative traits, leading to them being murderous towards Gregory, so wouldn't Rockstar Bonnie be under the control of Glitchtrap as well? Why would Glitchtrap attack himself? Well, let's take a new look at Glamrock Bonnie's resting place and analyze a little further. Looking at Glamrock Bonnie's corpse, you'll see that he's surrounded by 4 wet floorbots with glowing yellow eyes. Looking closely at Bonnie's eyes show us that his are glowing as well. Weird. But what does this mean? Well, let's take a closer look at the wet floorbots. Throughout Ruin, you can find these bots scattered about the lead up of Chapter 7, the chapter where you find Bonnie, and the wet floorbots have an interesting mechanic. While in the real world, they just seem to be stationary, watching you as you pass them, once you put on the mask, you get a different story. In the AR world, approaching the wet floorbots presents you with echoed cries of what sounds like children. Until you turn them off. It's a very unsettling detail and begs the question of what this has to do with Glamrock Bonnie. I mean, these couldn't possibly be the cries of real children, right? Well, that's where I beg to differ. See, Security Breach had multiple endings, each giving you different looks at different outcomes that could happen based on what paths Gregory took. One of these endings is very interesting for the topic of this video. One of the endings, and possibly the easiest to get, is right at the end of the game when you're presented with an option to leave. Choosing that option prompts this comic where we see Gregory escape and sleep in a cardboard box using a newspaper as a blanket. Well, as the camera zooms in on the headline, we get a bombshell of information. The newspaper headline reads, "Missing. Local residents continue to disappear." We are being told that not only the 9 faces we see on the newspaper are missing persons, but that there are even more for this to be a continuous problem. I think it's pretty obvious that the Pizzaplex has something to do with it, and judging from the silhouettes in the newspaper and Vanny's tendency to try and lure our childlike protagonists, that most of these, if not all of these faces, are of children. However, it's important to note that not only children disappear at the Pizzaplex. In fact, there's probably an equal amount or even more adults that go missing here as well, and we can point to 2 specific examples. The first example comes from the therapy CDs we find scattered around the Pizzaplex. These therapy CDs can then be put into a CD player in Mike's room. Don't question the Mike's room part, that's a whole other can of worms. Well, from these CDs, we get therapy tapes that alternate between being about Vanessa and a therapist and a mysterious patient 46 and a therapist. Patient 46 is Gregory, I mean, it's pretty obvious, but none of that is really important. What is important is what the tapes tell us about the therapist, specifically what happens to each of them. We learn that all 4, and presumably the 5th one as well, go missing, with one of them being confirmed dead, and what's interesting is how it's described. The 4th therapist decides to tell the mysterious patient 46, a child, about how one of the previous one's bodies was found and how it looked mangled by machinery. Now, I don't know about you, but when I hear this line, my mind immediately darts to the ending of Help Wanted 2. If you'll remember, in Help Wanted 2, we end the game with our protagonist getting stuffed into the mapbot that gives Cassie her AR mask at the hands of Glitchtrap, establishing that Glitchtrap has the same MO as the original Afton, stuffing things into animatronic suits. Well, this time it's more robots than animatronics, but you get the general idea. The thing is, though, we can deduce heavily from clues in the game that this patient 46, Gregory, is under Glitchtrap's control, as well as Vanessa. We don't really need to worry about which patient is the one actively killing these therapists, because either way, those bodies are being put into staff bots. It's just one of them was found. But this idea expands into an even more brutal fashion when we go into a second disturbing piece of lore this game holds: the all-staff party. Remember how I said you can find these messages about Glamrock Bonnie in duffel bags? Well, there's another set of messages that are even stranger. The first message goes, all-staff meeting. Reminder to all employees, the all-staff meeting is this Thursday night at 11:30 p.m. All service team attendance is mandatory. There will be cake. We then get one more message referring to this all-staff meeting through the log, job security. Where is everyone? Leo was the only one who had a copy of the maze control key, but I haven't seen him for months. Maybe that creepy bot knows where the key is. Leo was supposed to train it to work the maze. Instead, he tricked the bot into doing busy work under the daycare theater. I'll check after the all-staff meeting tonight. What's even more strange about this log is that the worker Leo has been missing for months. In fact, most of the staff is gone even before this all-staff party, almost as if someone has been taking these staff members out. Even weirder is how this log talks about the staff bots being creepy and saying it's doing the same work Leo was supposed to be doing under the daycare theater. But what about this meeting? Well, we can actually find this room in game, and to say it's destroyed is an understatement. It's wrecked, and swarming the area are staff bots. I say all of this to tell you that the staff members aren't just being replaced by staff bots, they are the staff bots stuffed inside of them, or their souls put in them, just like our very own Help Wanted 2 protagonist and our therapist. But if all of these adults are in the staff bots, where are the children? Well, I'm here to tell you, my Freddles, that the children are stuffed into wet floor signs. Remember, we can hear the cries of what seems to be children's souls coming from these bots. The reason we hear this is because the children are trapped in them. But what does this have to do with Glamrock Bonnie? Well, Glamrock Bonnie is Golden Freddy. In a sense. Now, I know that sounds a little insane, but just hear me out. Looking at Glamrock Bonnie's death from how we see it in game is strange. Why are these wet floor bots surrounding him in this formation? Well, take your camera and place it above them. Suddenly, the image looks a little familiar, doesn't it? 4 hunched over bodies, the wet floor bots with something in the middle, an extra figure. Freddles, I think the imagery is clear. This is a representation of give gifts, give life, and Bonnie is our Golden Freddy. This isn't even the first time we've gotten this imagery in Security Breach. Close to the beginning of the base game, you can find these staff bots clearly in the same position, and as for Glamrock Bonnie and Golden Freddy, look no further than Help Wanted 2. In Help Wanted 2, you can collect these memory dolls, each representing a victim of the MCI and Charlotte. Now, as you collect each one, they appear in your hub area, and the location of each is telling. First, we have Freddie, who, being the main singer, is by the main stage. Next is Bonnie, who is Cassie's dad's favorite, and so he is placed with Roxy, Cassie's favorite, and Glamrock Freddy, Gregory's favorite. Foxy is by MCM Projects because he is an MCM character. The puppet is the weirdest, being by a Freddy painting, likely representing how she died at a Freddy's location, and Chatterteeth telling us it was at a location where the bite happened. Chica is by the kitchen, and finally, Golden Freddy is by the decapitated head of a staff bot to represent the crying child. However, that's not all he's next to. Golden Freddy is also right next to a plush of no one else but our very own Glamrock Bonnie. Boom! This solidifies the connection. There's something to be said about Glamrock Bonnie being Golden Freddy, but what? And how does this tie into his death? Well, let's pull out our extra super duper huge magnifying glass and take a microscopic look at the situation. Glamrock Bonnie's eyes. That's the real detail here. They glow the same yellow as the wet floor bots and fade away as soon as all of them are deactivated, almost as if he is the final wet floor bot. But that wouldn't make any sense. We know the wet floor bots are possessed, so wouldn't that make Glamrock Bonnie possessed? Freddles, this entire time, I've been keeping the final piece to this puzzle, and that was for good reason. And that was who exactly was directing Glamrock Bonnie on where to go and lure him to a party room in Roxy Raceway. And that person was Vanny. Let me explain. In Rockstar Row, you can find all kinds of interesting relics of Fazbear past, and none more interesting than these FNAF 2 posters placed outside the green room. You might ask, why? Well, that's because all of them are lit up except for one. Toy Bonnie, leaving the Toy Bonnie poster shrouded in shadows. You see where I'm going with this? Not only that, but in Bonnie's Little Diner by Bonnible, you can find a paper pal of Shadow Bonnie ominously there by a hallway. But this mystery grows even deeper when just outside Bonnie's backstage room, you can find two interesting pieces. A staff bot begging to be let into his room facing away from an ominous Toy Bonnie plush. Why Toy Bonnie? Well, remember that poster back in Rockstar Row, the Toy Bonnie shrouded in darkness? Well, I think there's a connection to be made between these two. But why Vanny? What do Vanny and Shadow Bonnie have to do with each other? And that's a good question. I was stumped as well, but that was until I thought about it a little more and looked back at the security log from Bonnie being lured. He's reported as the only one walking around. There's no Bonnie and Monty or Bonnie and Vanessa, and I found that particularly strange. Why? Bonnie didn't just suddenly wake up in the middle of the night and think, oh man, I can't wait to walk around aimlessly until I end up in Monty Golf. And you'd be right. He wouldn't think that. Someone with the technology and power to go unseen on cameras would. And who else than the head of security herself, Vanessa. In Security Breach, we learn that Vanny can kind of distort technology that's in her presence. In fact, Fazbear tech like Glamrock Freddy can't see her. If Vanessa possesses the tech to cloak herself from the animatronics, who's to say she couldn't do cameras as well? Who's to say she couldn't have used her Vanny suit to influence Bonnie to walk from Rockstar Row to Roxy Raceway and fill the role of a shadow in Follow Me? But what was Bonnie doing in that time? Well, remember what I said about him being possessed? It just so happens the Pizzaplex, and especially the path from Rockstar Row to Monty Golf, is littered with wet floor bots. Bots that Bonnie was either communicating with or actively trying to free. This connection is what happens to establish a reasoning for Glitchtrap to want Glamrock Bonnie taken out. And with all of our information, we can deduce what actually happened to Glamrock Bonnie. One day, somehow, one of the spirits of the missing children throughout the Pizzaplex finds its way into Glamrock Bonnie. Perhaps Glitchtrap used Glamrock Bonnie to kill a kid, but didn't anticipate it to latch onto its killer with a vengeful spark. The rest of the kids are trapped in wet floorbots, all of them sharing the mark of possession through their piercing, glowing eyes. However, Glamrock Bonnie was able to go undetected due to his signature star-shaped sunglasses obscuring his eyes. Time goes by, and while Glamrock Bonnie, now under the influence of a vengeful spirit, actively tries to free the souls trapped in the yellow plastic, Glitchtrap suspects something. Glamrock Bonnie wasn't under his control anymore, and he knew it, and so he decided to act. He sends out Vanny to influence Glamrock Bonnie to walk through the Pizzaplex, interacting with the wet floor bots along the way. Vanny acts as a shadow in this case. Instead of Shadow Freddy, it's Shadow Bonnie, luring Bonnie from the East Arcade through the closed-down prize counter and into Monty Golf. From there, Vanessa cuts the security report. To anyone's knowledge, the last Glamrock Bonnie was seen was in Monty Golf, an area where no sign of struggle would be seen. Glamrock Bonnie is lured across the atrium and into Roxy Raceway's first party room. There, waiting for him in darkness, is a jealous gator under the control of Glitchtrap, who pummels Glamrock Bonnie into a shattered hunk of junk who would never be repaired again. Glitchtrap knows Fazbear Entertainment could repair Bonnie if they wanted to. They repair Monty when he's torn in half only a couple weeks later, but Glitchtrap doesn't ever want that to happen. He keeps the soul trapped in an unmoving body, crippled like that of Golden Freddy, until its puppet, Cassie, comes and sets all of the souls free in a happiest day, freeing their souls. But with Cassie trapped below by the end, she wasn't able to yet free the souls trapped in the staff bots, who themselves are trying to get a happiest day of their own. What do you think of my interpretation of events? Do you agree or disagree? I think it's really strong and likely what could have very well happened. I'm extremely confident in it, but let me know your thoughts with a long, respectful comment. Remember to be respectful to others, because at the end of the day, it's just a FNAF theory. Also, there's other pieces of evidence I forgot to mention, like how Glamrock Bonnie has a final blow with a bowling ball hitting his head, and the bowling ball happens to be a Roxy bowling ball, furthering the connection between him and Roxy Raceway, but that's neither here nor there. Thank you for watching.